Right now, somewhere in a design office, engineers are sketching a ship that no single person will ever finish building or finish riding. A child could be born aboard that ship, live a full life aboard it, and die aboard it, having never once felt sunlight that wasn't simulated, and never once set foot on the world their great-great-grandparents left, or the one their descendants might someday reach. The nearest star with a confirmed rocky planet in its habitable zone sits over 4 light-years away, and even at the fastest speeds humanity has ever achieved, the crossing would take longer than the entire recorded history of writing. But here is the part most people miss when they imagine this. The real barrier was never the distance. It is what happens to a group of human beings sealed inside a metal world for centuries, generation folding into generation, until the ship itself becomes the only reality anyone has ever known. If you enjoy deep space and science content, do me a small favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and there is much more like this coming. Make yourself comfortable. Let's begin. The idea sounds at first like something borrowed from fiction. A ship the size of a city, generations born inside it, growing old inside it, dying inside it, while the vessel itself drifts on toward a destination that only their descendants will ever see. It sounds invented. It is not. In simple terms, a generation ship is any spacecraft designed to complete an interstellar journey too long for a single human lifetime, meaning the original crew must reproduce, raise children, and pass the mission itself down like an inheritance. Not a metaphorical inheritance, a literal one. The ship, the purpose, the destination, all handed from parent to child for as long as the voyage requires. This is different from 2 other ideas people often confuse it with. A sleeper ship keeps its crew in some form of suspended stasis, aging slowly or not at all, arriving as the same people who left. A generation ship offers no such shortcut. Everyone aboard when it launches will die aboard it, mid-journey, having handed the mission to children who never chose it. To put this in human terms, imagine boarding a ship as a young adult knowing, with total certainty, that you will spend your entire life inside it, and that your children, and quite possibly your grandchildren, will do the same before anyone sets foot on solid ground again. The concept has a real history, and it is older than most people assume. Robert Goddard, the American rocket pioneer, envisioned a vessel carrying a civilization from a dying solar system toward another star as early as 1918, though he was reportedly cautious about professional criticism, and the manuscript stayed sealed for decades before it was published. Around the same period, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and the physicist J.D. Bernal were independently writing about artificial worlds and self-contained habitats capable of sustaining life indefinitely, ideas that would later feed directly into serious generation ship theory. These were not casual musings. They were early attempts by trained scientists to solve a problem that refused to go away. The idea moved from speculation into formal engineering analysis in 1952, when the British scientist Leslie Shepard published a paper titled Interstellar Flight in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. Shepard examined the practical requirements of a voyage lasting centuries or longer, describing what he called a Noah's Ark, a nuclear-propelled, million-ton interstellar vessel shaped like a flattened sphere. He was blunt about the scale of what this would demand. Shepard emphasized the necessity of disciplined population management to sustain a functioning human society across roughly 30 generations. With voyages potentially lasting 1,000 years or more, given the propulsion limits of the era. 30 generations. Consider what that number actually holds. It is not one crew making one long trip. It is 30 separate human generations. Infancy, childhood, adulthood, old age, death, cycling completely, one after another, inside a sealed metal world, before anyone aboard reaches the place their ancestors set out for. Shepard himself seemed to sense the strangeness of what he was proposing. He wrote in the same paper that such a ship would depart under the authority of one government and arrive under the authority of a government so distant in time it would be unrecognizable. The vessel leaving, in his words, as though under one ruler and arriving under a successor, separated by centuries of history. This is the part that makes generation ships different from every other spacecraft humanity has ever built. A probe like Voyager only has to survive. It doesn't have to remain a functioning society. It doesn't need governance or shared purpose or a next generation willing to keep going. A generation ship must do all of that, continuously without interruption, for longer than most nations in human history have managed to stay intact. It is not a vehicle in the way we normally use that word. It is closer to an entire self-contained civilization, given a single, narrow purpose, and set loose across a gap that light itself takes years to cross. Which raises the obvious question. If interstellar distances are this punishing, why would anyone design a ship built to take centuries when the goal of any voyage is presumably to arrive? Why not simply build something faster? The honest answer is that we have already tried to outrun the problem with speed, and the numbers refuse to cooperate. The nearest confirmed rocky exoplanet sitting inside a star's habitable zone, Proxima Centauri b, orbits a star roughly 4.24 light-years from Earth. That distance sounds almost modest, spoken aloud in a single breath. It is not modest. It is 25 trillion miles. And humanity's fastest achievements, measured against that gap, barely register. Consider Voyager 1, humanity's most distant human-made object, launched in 1977 and still transmitting data after decades of continuous travel. It is, by any ordinary standard, one of our greatest engineering triumphs. And yet, at its current speed, Voyager 1 would require approximately 73,000 years to reach the Proxima Centauri system. To put that in human terms, a person born the year Voyager finally arrived would be looking back at a journey older than the entire span of recorded human civilization, several times over. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Voyager's crossing alone would consume nearly a quarter of that entire span, and this is our fastest surviving outbound spacecraft. This is not a failure of ambition or funding. It is arithmetic. Chemical propulsion, the technology behind every crewed launch in human history, has a hard ceiling built into the chemistry itself. The energy released by burning fuel can only push exhaust out of a nozzle so fast, no matter how cleverly the rocket is engineered. Even more advanced propulsion concepts still under research, things like nuclear thermal engines or ion drives, improve the picture, but not nearly enough. None of them get a spacecraft to Proxima Centauri within a single human lifetime, while still allowing for the mass of food, water, shielding, and structure a living crew would need to survive the trip. This is the wall every serious interstellar mission concept eventually runs into. You can increase speed, you can shave decades off a journey through nuclear propulsion, or theoretical technologies still confined to physics papers. But you cannot currently engineer your way into a journey short enough to fit inside one human life, not to Proxima Centauri, and certainly not to anywhere farther. The gap between what propulsion can achieve and what raw distance demands is not a narrow one. It is a chasm, so the problem inverts itself. If the ship cannot be made to outrun the journey, then the only remaining option is to make the passengers outlast it. Not through speed, but through succession. Through birth, childhood, adulthood, and death, repeated inside the vessel itself. Generation folding into generation until enough time has passed that someone eventually arrives. Not the person who left, their descendants. People who never chose the mission, who inherited it the way they inherited a language or a family name. Born already partway through a journey that started before they existed and will very likely end after they are gone. This is not a workaround. It is a complete redefinition of what the vehicle has to be. A ship built to travel for 6 centuries, or 10 or 30 generations worth of human lives, cannot simply be a very large, very well-stocked capsule. It has to function as something closer to a self-sufficient world, one that manufactures its own air, grows its own food, replaces its own dying components, and somehow keeps a functioning human society intact for far longer than any nation, empire, or institution in recorded history has ever managed to survive without collapse or rupture. Which means the real engineering problem was never about engines at all. It begins with something much stranger. How do you build a machine shaped like a world? If a generation ship must function as a self-sufficient world rather than a vehicle, the first problem an engineer faces has nothing to do with engines. It is gravity, or rather, the absence of it. Long-duration weightlessness is not a minor inconvenience. It steadily weakens bone density and muscle mass, and over a journey lasting centuries, unmitigated weightlessness would be catastrophic, generation after generation growing frailer than the one before. So most serious generation ship designs solve this the same way, and the solution is almost mechanically simple. Spin the ship and let physics do the rest. The most influential version of this idea came from Gerard K. O'Neill, a physicist at Princeton, who published his concept in a 1976 book titled The High Frontier: Human Colonies in Space. O'Neill's design, now generally known as the O'Neill cylinder, proposed a pair of counter-rotating cylinders, each roughly 32 kilometers long and several kilometers wide. Rotating in opposite directions cancels out the gyroscopic forces that would otherwise fight against steering the structure. A detail that sounds technical, but solves a real and stubborn engineering headache. Consider what this means in practice. 2 cities worth of structure, spinning slowly and silently in the dark, each one cancelling the other's tendency to twist off course. The rotation itself does the work that gravity does on Earth, through what's called centripetal force, the same physics that presses you into your seat on a fairground ride, just engineered gently enough to feel like standing still. To produce something close to Earth's gravity, O'Neill's original design called for a cylinder roughly 3.2 kilometers in radius, spinning at approximately half a rotation per minute. That number matters more than it sounds like it should. Spin too fast, and the human inner ear starts sending confused signals to the brain, producing nausea and disorientation. Spin too slow, and you need an impossibly large structure to generate useful gravity at all. Half a rotation per minute threads that needle. It is slow enough that a person standing inside would likely never consciously notice they were spinning at all, and yet fast enough to press their feet firmly to the floor. Inside, the design gets almost eerily domestic. Sunlight would enter through long windows running the length of the cylinder, sometimes redirected by external mirrors, providing something close to a natural day and night cycle. Agricultural land, residential areas, and even small bodies of water were part of O'Neill's original vision. Not because it was aesthetically pleasing, but because a ship carrying people for centuries needs its inhabitants to feel as much as physics allows, like they are living somewhere rather than riding something. A generation ship is not simply cargo in transit. It has to feel enough like a world that people can be born into it, grow up in it, fall in love in it, and never once experience the specific, gnawing wrongness of living inside a machine. And this is where the real difficulty begins to surface. A rotating cylinder solves gravity. It does not solve air. It does not solve food. It does not solve what happens when the soil inside that agricultural land begins, slowly and invisibly, to behave in ways nobody predicted. Because we have already tried building a sealed, self-contained world here on Earth, under far gentler conditions than deep space would ever allow, and it went wrong in ways nobody saw coming until the numbers on an oxygen sensor started sliding downward, month after month, with no clear explanation. In September of 1991, 8 people sealed themselves inside a 3-acre glass and steel structure in the Arizona desert, called Biosphere 2. The project's entire purpose was to test whether humans could build a materially closed ecological system, one that recycled its own air, water, and food indefinitely, with nothing coming in or going out. The closest terrestrial analogue that has ever existed to a generation ship's life support. In simple terms, it was meant to be a small, controlled rehearsal for exactly the kind of engineering a real interstellar arc would eventually need. It didn't go as planned. Over the first 16 months of the closure, oxygen levels inside the structure fell steadily, from a normal 21% down to 14%, a concentration roughly equivalent to standing at 11,000 feet of elevation, thin enough to cause real health problems for the crew. For a long stretch, nobody inside or outside the project understood exactly where the oxygen was going. It wasn't leaking out through some structural flaw. It was disappearing while the structure remained sealed, which made the mystery more unsettling, not less. The eventual explanation, published by researchers including Jeffrey Severinghaus and Wallace Brooker, turned out to be almost poetic in its cruelty. The soil inside Biosphere 2 had been enriched with unusually large amounts of organic matter to help crops grow, and that rich soil fed enormous populations of microbes, which consumed oxygen and produced carbon dioxide as they broke the organic matter down. Ordinarily, plants would absorb that excess carbon dioxide and cycle the oxygen back into the air. But a second, unplanned process was quietly working against them. The structure's exposed concrete was reacting chemically with the carbon dioxide in the air, locking it away as calcium carbonate, absorbing roughly 750 kilomoles of it over the course of the experiment. The carbon dioxide that should have fed the plants and cycled back into breathable oxygen was instead being slowly swallowed by the walls themselves. What this means in practice is worth sitting with. A team of trained scientists, building a sealed ecosystem under ideal, fully monitored conditions on the surface of the Earth, still could not predict how their own building materials would interact with their own soil chemistry. Nobody had engineered a flaw into Biosphere 2. Nobody made an obvious mistake. The system failed through the accumulated interaction of 100 small, reasonable design choices, each one fine in isolation, catastrophic in combination. By January of 1993, Outside oxygen had to be pumped in to keep the crew safe, ending, in the most literal sense, the experiment's claim to being a closed system at all. Now stretch that same problem across centuries instead of 2 years, and across a spacecraft instead of a desert enclosure, with no planet nearby to send emergency oxygen if the balance tips the wrong way. A generation ship's closed-loop life support has to get this right, not for 16 months, but for the entire duration of a journey that may last longer than every empire in recorded history has managed to survive intact. Biosphere 2 had access to the outside world the moment things went wrong. A ship crossing interstellar space would not. Whatever imbalance emerges, however small and however slowly it builds, the crew would have to detect it, understand it, and correct it themselves, using only what they carry, light years from anyone who could help. And oxygen is only the visible half of what space does to a body over time. There is a second threat working just as patiently, one that leaves no warning smell and trips no alarm. It simply accumulates, quietly, in the cells of everyone aboard. Air can be measured. Oxygen levels can be tracked on a gauge, hour by hour, the way Biosphere 2's engineers eventually learned to watch theirs. Radiation is different. It leaves no smell, trips no obvious alarm, and does its damage at the level of the cell, quietly, over years, which is exactly what makes it dangerous for a voyage measured in centuries rather than months. Outside the shelter of Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere, spacecraft are bathed in 2 overlapping sources of radiation. One comes from the sun itself, in bursts tied to solar activity. The other, called galactic cosmic radiation, arrives constantly from deep space, generated by exploding stars and other high-energy events far beyond our solar system. And it is far harder to shield against, because it consists of particles moving at such extreme energies that they can pass straight through the metal hull of a spacecraft. We already have real human data on what long-duration exposure does to a body, thanks to one of the more unusual experiments in spaceflight history. In 2015, NASA astronaut Scott Kelly spent 340 days aboard the International Space Station, while his identical twin brother, Mark, also a former astronaut, remained on Earth. Because the 2 men share identical genetics, researchers had something they almost never get: a matched biological baseline. Whatever differences emerged between the brothers could be attributed, with unusual confidence, to the year one of them spent in space. The results, published in the years following the mission, were genuinely strange. Scott's telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes, which typically shorten as a normal part of aging, actually lengthened during his time in orbit. But that lengthening did not hold. Within days of landing back on Earth, most of those telomeres shortened again, and by the study's end, Scott had more critically short telomeres than he'd had before the mission ever began. Alongside this, researchers documented lasting DNA damage and chromosome changes consistent with radiation exposure, some of which persisted even 6 months after he returned home. To put this in human terms, consider what that means for a single year in low Earth orbit, still shielded, at that altitude, by a good deal of Earth's protective magnetic field. A generation ship traveling through interstellar space has no such shelter. It is exposed to the full, undiluted force of galactic cosmic radiation for years that stretch into decades, that stretch into centuries, across bodies that must also somehow reproduce and raise children who inherit whatever damage has accumulated in their parents' cells. This is where the problem stops being medical and becomes structural. A ship's designers cannot simply accept a certain amount of radiation exposure as the cost of the mission, the way a single astronaut might accept elevated cancer risk in exchange for a historic flight. A generation ship's population has to remain viable for reproduction across dozens of generations. Shielding becomes one of the single heaviest engineering demands on the entire vessel. Thick walls of water, polyethylene, or packed regolith wrapped around every inhabited section, adding enormous mass to a structure that already has to carry centuries' worth of food, air, and materials. Every kilogram of shielding is a kilogram that isn't propulsion, or habitat, or spare parts for machinery that will eventually begin to fail. Radiation, in other words, is not a hazard. A generation ship simply survives once. It is a hazard the ship's entire population must survive continuously, generation after generation, in a way that leaves measurable fingerprints in the bodies and, potentially, in the descendants of everyone who ever lived aboard. Which raises a much older, much stranger problem than shielding. If radiation and other stresses can leave marks on the body of a single crew member over a single year, what happens to the underlying genetic health of an entire population, sealed together, breeding only within itself for 300 years? Every generation ship begins with a founding population, and that number, more than almost anything else aboard, decides whether the mission survives its own biology. This is not a question about willpower or discipline. It is a question rooted in population genetics, and it turns out to be one of the most contested numbers in the entire field of interstellar mission design. We already have small, real-world human populations to study, though none quite as extreme as a sealed spacecraft. The island of Tristan da Cunha, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, was settled from a founding group of just 8 men and 7 women. Pitcairn Island was founded by an even smaller group. Both communities remained isolated for roughly 2 centuries. Tristan da Cunha did experience some documented problems associated with inbreeding, though relatively mild ones. Pitcairn, for its part, showed less evidence of the same strain, at least within that time frame. Consider what this tells us and what it does not. 2 centuries of isolation from a founding population smaller than 100 people did not immediately collapse either community. But 2 centuries is a narrow window, and a generation ship's voyage, in Shepard's original 1952 estimate, could last 1,000 years or more, roughly 5 times longer than either island settlement has yet endured. This is where the scientific literature genuinely disagrees, and it is worth being honest about that disagreement rather than pretending a single number has been settled. Researchers who have modeled this problem specifically for interstellar migration have proposed dramatically different founding population sizes. One anthropologist's 2013 review, focused specifically on multi-generational interstellar voyaging, argued for a founding population in the range of tens of thousands in order to preserve enough genetic diversity across roughly 5 generations while absorbing the effects of inbreeding, genetic drift, and at least one anticipated demographic catastrophe along the way. Other researchers modeling the same basic problem with different assumptions and mating strategies have proposed numbers closer to a few hundred. In simple terms, the honest scientific answer is that this is an open question, one where the size of the founding crew depends enormously on how carefully reproduction itself would need to be managed across the generations that follow. And managed is the operative word, because unmanaged reproduction inside a small, closed population is where the genetic risk compounds. Inbreeding depression, the technical term for the loss of fitness that occurs when genetically similar individuals interbreed, works by increasing the chance that harmful recessive traits, normally masked by genetic diversity, get expressed. In a population of thousands scattered across a planet, this risk stays low, diluted by the sheer number of possible pairings. In a population of a few hundred, sealed inside a metal hull with no way to introduce new genetic material from outside, the risk climbs with every generation that fails to actively manage who has children with whom. What this means in practice is that a generation ship's survival is not just an engineering problem or a life support problem. It is, from the very first generation onward, a population management problem, one that would likely require careful record-keeping, deliberate pairing decisions, and possibly frozen genetic material carried specifically to widen the gene pool artificially when needed. To put this in human terms, imagine a small town, isolated from every other town on Earth, that has to plan not just who marries whom, but who has children with whom, generation after generation, for 300 years, purely to keep the underlying population from slowly breaking down at the level of DNA. This is genetics as infrastructure, as load-bearing as the hull itself, and just as unforgiving of neglect. But genetics only governs whether bodies survive intact. It says nothing about whether the minds inside those bodies can endure a life that begins and ends entirely inside the same sealed world, with no horizon that isn't also a wall. Every generation ship faces a category of problem that has nothing to do with oxygen, radiation, or genetics. It is the question of what it does to a human mind to live an entire life inside a sealed, unchanging environment, with no possibility of leaving and no true horizon in sight. For the founding crew, this is a choice made with open eyes. For every generation that follows, it is simply the condition of being born. We don't have direct data on multi-generational isolation because nothing like a generation ship has ever existed. But we do have real research on the closest available analog, drawn from some of the most isolated human outposts on Earth. Antarctic overwintering stations, particularly remote sites like Concordia Station on the Antarctic Plateau, have become one of the most studied stand-ins for long-duration spaceflight, precisely because their crews face months of confinement, extreme isolation, and no possibility of rescue or evacuation once the winter darkness sets in. The documented psychological patterns from these missions are consistent enough to have earned their own names in the research literature. Scientists have described something called winter over syndrome, involving sleep disturbances, cognitive decline, fatigue, anxiety, and depressive symptoms that tend to worsen as the winter season progresses. There's a related phenomenon sometimes called the third quarter effect, where irritability, insomnia, and cognitive impairment tend to peak during the latter middle portion of a long isolation period, after the initial adjustment has worn off, but before the relief of an eventual return is close enough to feel real. A recent study at Concordia Station, tracking 12 crew members across a 10-month overwintering mission using both surveys and wearable proximity sensors, found something particularly relevant to a generation ship's design. Feelings of loneliness and interpersonal conflict increased progressively over the course of the mission, while overall group cohesion and individual performance declined. And critically, more frequent close contact between crew members did not ease this strain. It often made it worse, correlating with higher rates of conflict and paranoid thinking rather than functioning as social support. In simple terms, simply placing people in close proximity to one another for long stretches does not automatically produce connection. Sometimes it produces friction that has nowhere to dissipate. Now consider what separates even the harshest Antarctic mission from a generation ship. Concordia's crews know with total certainty that winter ends. There is a departure date. There is an outside world waiting, unchanged, for their return. A generation ship offers no such certainty to most of the people who will ever live aboard it. Only the first generation chose the voyage. Only the final generation will experience its end. Everyone in between, the vast majority of everyone who is ever born, lives and dies inside the vessel, will spend an entire human life in a psychological environment closer to a permanent Antarctic winter than any mission ever studied, except without the one thing that makes Antarctic winters survivable: the knowledge that it ends. To put this in human terms, imagine growing up entirely within Concordia Station's walls, never once stepping outside into open air that isn't manufactured, marrying someone you met inside those same walls, raising children who have never seen an unenclosed sky, and who will, in turn, raise children of their own inside the same sealed structure, having never known any other kind of life was possible. This is not a hardship the middle generations endure. It is simply their entire concept of what a human life is. This raises a strange and unavoidable design question that ripples outward into everything else about the ship. If neither the mission's beginning nor its end belongs to most of the people who live and die inside it, who exactly holds the ship's purpose steady across 300 years? And what happens to authority itself, generation after generation, once the founders who first agreed to the voyage are gone? If the middle generations of a voyage inherit a mission they never chose, someone still has to hold that mission together. Decisions have to be made, resources have to be rationed, conflicts have to be resolved, and all of this has to happen without the one thing every government on Earth has always had, even in its worst moments: an outside world to appeal to flee to, or to be checked by. To understand how difficult this problem actually is, it helps to look at the most durable governing institutions humanity has ever managed to sustain under far gentler conditions than a sealed spacecraft. San Marino, the small republic in the Italian peninsula, traces its founding to the year 301 and has maintained a form of republican governance, elected leadership, and institutional continuity for over 1,700 years, surviving the fall of Rome, medieval conflict, Napoleon's conquests, and 2 world wars. Iceland's Althing, established in the year 930, is generally regarded as the world's oldest parliamentary institution, with a legislative tradition stretching back more than 1,000 years, though its continuity was interrupted for a period under Danish rule before full independence was restored in 1944. These are, by any reasonable measure, the most stable governing institutions human civilization has ever produced. And even they were not perfectly unbroken. Iceland's parliament experienced a genuine interruption in its sovereign authority. San Marino's 17 centuries were not 17 centuries without crisis, upheaval, or internal conflict. They were 17 centuries in which the institution, battered but intact, kept finding a way to continue. In simple terms, even our best historical examples of long-term governance show real strain, real interruption, and constant adaptation, not smooth, untroubled continuity. Now compare that to what a generation ship would require. Shepard's original 1952 estimate placed the voyage at potentially 1,000 years or more, longer than San Marino's entire recorded existence, achieved not on a stable, resource-rich peninsula with access to trade, allies, and an ever-changing outside world for comparison, but inside a single sealed vessel, with a fixed and shrinking set of physical resources and absolutely no outside authority to appeal to if something goes fundamentally wrong. There is no neighboring nation to flee toward, no larger body to intervene if a leader consolidates too much power, or a crisis of succession turns violent. Whatever governance structure the ship's designers build has to be, in a very literal sense, the only law that exists for centuries at a time. Consider what this demands of a system of authority. It must survive multiple full turnovers of leadership, as every single person who understood the ship's original founding purpose eventually dies, replaced by descendants who know that purpose only through education and inherited memory, not lived experience. It must resist the kind of internal drift that has ended nearly every long-lived human institution on Earth. Generally not through outside conquest, but through slow internal decay, corruption, or fracture. And it must do all of this while simultaneously managing life support, genetics, radiation shielding, and food production. With a population small enough that a single bad leader or a single generation's mistake could threaten the survival of everyone who comes after. What this means in practice is that a generation ship's constitution, whatever form it takes, may be the single most fragile piece of the entire mission. More fragile than the hull, more fragile than the engines. Because unlike metal and machinery, governance depends entirely on people continuing to believe in and abide by an agreement none of them personally made. And belief itself, it turns out, is not the only thing that drifts quietly across centuries of isolation. The very words used to express that belief begin changing too, slowly, generation by generation, until the language spoken at the journey's end may barely resemble the one spoken at its start. Governments can be written down, laws can be codified, filed, and referenced across centuries. Language is different. It lives only in the mouths of the people speaking it in any given moment, which means it is one of the most unstable things a generation ship's culture will carry, and one of the first things likely to change in ways nobody planned for. We know this happens quickly because we have documented cases of entirely new languages forming, in real, verifiable timeframes, when a population becomes isolated from its original linguistic community. Sranan Tongo, a language that emerged in Dutch Suriname from contact between English colonists and enslaved populations speaking a range of West African languages, had already formed as a stable, learnable language by around 1667. In simple terms, within 1 to 2 generations, an entirely new grammar, vocabulary, and set of linguistic rules had crystallized, distinct enough to be considered its own language, rather than a modified version of any of its source languages. This is a broader pattern linguists have observed repeatedly, not just in colonial contact situations, but in any small, isolated population cut off from a larger linguistic community. Research on geographically isolated island populations, for example, has found that isolation itself accelerates linguistic drift, largely because smaller populations lose and alter words faster than large, interconnected ones. In a huge population spread across a continent, dialects shift slowly, buffered by constant contact between speakers who correct and reinforce each other's usage. In a small sealed population, that buffering disappears, language changes faster, precisely because there are fewer speakers to hold the old version steady. Consider what this means for a generation ship. The founding crew would leave Earth speaking whatever language or languages were standard at launch, complete with its idioms, its cultural references, its specific vocabulary for specific technologies and concepts. But every generation born aboard the ship learns that language not from the wider world, but exclusively from the generation immediately before them. Inside a sealed, unchanging environment, cut off from every other speaker of that language anywhere else in the universe. This is close to the exact demographic condition under which new languages have historically formed fastest. To put this in human terms, imagine a great-grandchild aboard a generation ship, centuries into the voyage, trying to read the ship's original founding documents, written in the language spoken back on Earth at launch. Depending on how much drift has occurred, those documents might already read the way a modern English speaker reads a text several centuries old. Technically decipherable, but strange, formal, subtly foreign, requiring real effort to pass. The mission's founding purpose, its laws, its accumulated technical knowledge, all of it recorded in a language that the ship's own descendants may need active translation to fully understand. This is not a cosmetic concern. Technical manuals, safety procedures, medical knowledge, and the ship's own operating history are only useful if future generations can still read them accurately. A misunderstood instruction, buried inside language that has quietly drifted just far enough to change meaning, is not a curiosity. Aboard a sealed vessel with no way to consult an outside expert, it could be catastrophic. Language, in other words, is not just how a generation ship's crew talks to each other. It is the thread that keeps hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge usable at all. And threads, stretched far enough, do not always hold. Which brings the ship's designers to a problem even harder to engineer around than drifting words. Because if language itself can quietly transform beyond recognition, what happens to something far less tangible? The reason for the voyage in the first place. There is a well-documented problem in economics and political science called time inconsistency, sometimes referred to as the long-term compliance problem. It describes something simple and uncomfortable. Institutions and governments routinely commit to long-term goals with full sincerity, and then abandon or quietly water down those goals over time. Not through any single dramatic betrayal, but through a slow accumulation of short-term pressures that always seem to matter more than a distant, abstract future. In simple terms, keeping a promise made to the far future turns out to be one of the hardest things any institution can do, even when everyone involved genuinely means to keep it. This problem exists even in situations with far lower stakes than a generation ship. Governments struggle to maintain multi-decade commitments on issues like fiscal policy or long-term environmental planning, precisely because the people making the sacrifice today are rarely the people who benefit from it, and the people who eventually inherit the consequences had no voice in the original decision. Researchers studying this dynamic have found that commitment mechanisms, such as binding legal structures or constitutional codification, can help, but they carry real costs and no guarantee of permanence. Consider what this reveals. Even with written law, formal institutions, and constant contact with the outside world providing accountability, human societies still struggle to keep long-term promises intact across a handful of decades. Now stretch that same problem across the interior of a generation ship, where the future generations are not an abstract policy consideration. They are the entire population. The founding crew leaves Earth for a specific, deeply felt reason: the survival of the species, the desire to reach a new world, the pull of genuine exploration. That reason is real and immediate to them, because they chose it, but their children didn't choose it. Their children's children will not choose it either. Each successive generation inherits the mission the way they inherit language and law, as something handed down rather than something felt. And a purpose that is inherited rather than chosen is structurally weaker than the one that started the journey. It has to be re-explained, generation after generation, by people who themselves only ever knew it second-hand. To put this in human terms, imagine trying to convince a great-great-grandchild that they should endure decades of rationed resources, restricted freedoms, and a life lived entirely within metal walls for the sake of a destination their ancestors chose, that they themselves have never seen a single image of beyond old records, and that they may not even live to reach. The founding crew had the sun on their faces when they made this choice. Their descendants have only the mission's own internal explanation of why the sun was worth leaving behind in the first place. This is where mission drift becomes a genuine risk to the Voyager's survival, not just its meaning. A population that stops believing the destination is worth the sacrifice does not necessarily rebel or mutiny in any dramatic sense. It is more likely to simply stop maintaining the parts of the mission that no longer feel urgent: deferred repairs, relaxed population planning, quietly abandoned protocols. The same slow erosion that time inconsistency research documents in far gentler institutional settings, except now applied to a sealed vessel where deferred maintenance is not an abstract cost. It is oxygen. It is structural integrity. It is the genetic health of the only population that exists. So even if a generation ship survives its engineering, its biology, and its governance, there remains this quieter, more human question underneath all of it. Does the mission survive as something anyone actually still wants? A ship can be structurally intact and still be, in every way that matters, adrift, carrying descendants who maintain its systems out of habit rather than conviction, executing a purpose that stopped feeling like their own generations before they were even born, which leads to a piece of the ship that gets far less attention than governance or purpose, but that ultimately determines whether any of this matters at all. Because none of the social or psychological problems mean anything if the ship itself, the physical machine carrying all of this, cannot survive its own journey through time. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, before moving further into the abstract mathematics of the voyage. We have, in a very real sense, already tried this. Not among the stars, but here, on Earth, under conditions gentler than any generation ship will ever face. And it is worth returning to that attempt one more time, not for its data, but for what it reveals about the difference between designing a system and living inside one. 8 people sealed themselves inside Biosphere 2 in September of 1991, believing they had accounted for the variables that mattered. They had. Mostly, they had planned for crop yields, for water recycling, for oxygen production through photosynthesis. What they had not fully anticipated was the quiet chemistry happening in their own walls, a slow conversation between soil, air, and concrete that no one had thought to model closely enough. 2 years is not a long time. It is one winter, one spring, one full turn of seasons repeated. And even across that shorter stretch, the unplanned found its way in. Now imagine that same uncertainty, not resolved by better modeling, but simply extended extended past 2 years into 2 decades, past 2 decades into 2 centuries. Every closed system carries within it the seeds of its own unpredictability, small interactions between materials and organisms that no design document fully captures because no design document can. Biosphere 2's failure was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was a failure of the universe being larger, in its fine details, than any single team of scientists, however careful, could fully anticipate in advance. The Antarctic stations tell a similar, quieter story. Concordia's isolated researchers know precisely when their winter ends. They carry that knowledge the way a candle carries its own light, small but steady, enough to walk by even in the dark months. And even with that certainty, even with rescue theoretically possible in true emergencies, the psychological data still show loneliness climbing, cohesion fraying, minds drifting into strange, hazy states researchers have given names to, because the pattern recurs so reliably it needed naming. Now take away the certain end date, take away the rescue option, extend the winter until it is not a season, but a species-scale inheritance, passed from parent to child, indefinitely. This is what a generation ship is really asking of the people who would live and die aboard it. Not simply to survive extreme conditions, the way an astronaut survives a mission or a polar researcher survives a winter. It is asking an entire population to make an extreme condition into an ordinary life, into breakfast, into childhood, into old age. The walls that a Biosphere 2 crew member counted down the days to leave would, for a generation ship's descendants, simply be the walls of the world. There would be no countdown, there would be no walking back out into an ordinary sky. And this, more than any single number about propulsion or radiation or population genetics, is the quiet, cumulative truth these small terrestrial rehearsals point toward. We built miniature versions of this problem, under kind conditions, with rescue available, with a defined endpoint, and still watched them strain in ways their designers hadn't fully foreseen. A generation ship offers none of those mercies. It offers only its own walls, its own recycled air, its own slowly drifting language and slowly aging machinery, carrying forward, indefinitely, whatever imperfections were quietly built into it at the start. Which leaves one last question worth asking plainly, gathering everything discussed so far into a single, unavoidable reckoning. Gather every piece discussed so far into a single frame, and the shape of the real challenge becomes clear. A generation ship does not fail for one reason. It does not succeed for one reason either. It requires several extraordinarily difficult things to remain true simultaneously, without interruption, for centuries. The closed-loop life support has to hold, not for 2 years the way Biosphere 2's did, before outside oxygen had to be pumped in, but indefinitely, self-correcting against imbalances nobody can fully predict in advance. The radiation shielding has to protect not one astronaut for 1 year, the way the twins' study measured, but every person aboard, across every generation, without the DNA damage and telomere disruption. Researchers documented in low Earth orbit, ever accumulating into something the population cannot absorb. The founding genetics have to be broad enough and carefully enough managed to avoid the inbreeding depression that even isolated island communities on Earth have shown real, if mild, signs of within 2 centuries, a fraction of the time a true interstellar voyage might require. The governance has to outlast San Marino's 17 centuries of survival, or Iceland's 1,000 years of parliamentary tradition, while facing a version of the problem neither institution ever had to solve completely alone, without any outside world to check its authority. Consider what it means to need all of this at once. Not any single one. All of them together, unbroken, for as long as the crossing takes. The language has to remain legible enough across generations of natural linguistic drift that descendants can still read their ancestors' safety procedures and technical manuals without the kind of quiet mistranslation that turned Sranan Tongo into a wholly new language within a generation or two. The mission's purpose has to survive being inherited rather than chosen, resisting the same slow erosion that time inconsistency research has documented in far gentler institutional settings, where societies routinely struggle to honor commitments made to a future they will never personally see. And the ship itself, the machinery underneath all of this, has to keep functioning the way no human-built object ever has, watt by watt, system by system, without the resupply or repair support that even Voyager 1, our most enduring spacecraft, has never needed after less than 50 years of decline. To put this in human terms, it is a little like asking a single family to keep a business running, unbroken for 1,000 years, using only tools they manufacture themselves, speaking a language that keeps quietly changing under them, governed by rules none of them personally agreed to, while their bodies slowly accumulate biological cost from an environment no completed generation ever fully escapes. Any one of these problems alone is difficult, but perhaps survivable. Biosphere 2 nearly solved its oxygen problem. San Marino has held its republic together for 17 centuries. Individual astronauts have endured a year of radiation exposure and returned largely intact. But a generation ship does not get to solve these problems one at a time, in sequence, learning from each failure before moving to the next. It has to hold all of them steady, together, for the ship's entire duration, because a single sustained failure in any one system does not stay contained to that system. A governance collapse threatens population management. A population genetics failure threatens the workforce needed to maintain life support. A life support failure threatens everyone, regardless of how well the language has held or how faithfully the mission's purpose has been passed down. This is not a reason to conclude the idea is impossible. Every terrestrial rehearsal discussed here, Biosphere 2, Concordia Station, Tristan da Cunha, San Marino's Long Republic, succeeded, at least partially, under conditions gentler than deep space will ever offer. It is a reason to understand what success actually requires. Not a clever engine, not a large enough hull. It requires something closer to a permanent civilization, self-correcting, self-governing, and self-sustaining, built to hold its shape across a span of time longer than most of what human history has ever produced intact. And somewhere inside that permanent, self-correcting civilization, centuries from now, someone will be born who never asked for any of this, and who will spend their entire life, from first breath to last, inside the answer to a question they never got to ask. Picture them for a moment, because eventually, if a ship like this is ever built, they will exist. Not the engineer who designed the rotating hull, not the founding crew member who chose to leave Earth behind, eyes open, accepting the terms. Someone born 150 years into the voyage, in a room lit by simulated daylight, inside a hull spinning slowly enough that they never once feel it turning. They will learn, as a child, that their home is moving. Not the way a person on Earth understands motion abstractly, as a fact about orbits and rotation felt nowhere in the body. They will learn it as something closer to a fact about identity. Their world is a journey. Their address is a velocity. They will be taught, probably early, the language their ancestors spoke at launch, and they may notice, if they are curious, that some of the oldest recorded messages from Earth already sound slightly foreign to their ear, the way old letters sometimes do, familiar and strange in the same sentence. They will never see the star their great-great-grandparents left behind, except as an old image, carefully preserved, dimmer now than the light in the room where they view it. They will never see the world their ship is traveling toward either. Not really, not in their own lifetime, only as projections, estimates, the accumulated calculations of people who died generations before they were born, and people who will be born generations after they are gone. Their entire life, every birthday, every friendship, every quiet, ordinary Tuesday will occur inside the exact middle of someone else's mission. Not the beginning, not the end, only the middle, stretched out into an entire human existence. And here is the strange, quiet dignity of it. They will likely not feel any of this as tragedy, most days. Consider how a child raised anywhere unusual comes to understand that place as simply normal, simply home, simply the shape the world takes. A person born mid-voyage will not spend their life mourning a sky they never had. They will fall in love inside these walls. They will argue with their parents inside these walls. They will find some part of the ship's rotating gardens or quiet observation decks that feels, to them specifically, like the one good place in the universe, the way any of us finds some ordinary corner of our own home and quietly decides it is sacred. But somewhere, on some quiet night cycle, they may look at the old recorded images of Earth, or the newer telescope data of the world, still centuries ahead, and feel the full, strange weight of their position pressing in. Neither beginning nor end, only middle, a single link in a chain stretched taut across centuries, holding without knowing exactly what shape the whole chain makes, trusting that the people before them held their portion honestly, and hoping, in whatever quiet way a person hopes for something they will never personally see, that the people after them will do the same. They did not choose this life. And yet, in some way that outlasts the question of choice entirely, this life is entirely, irreducibly theirs. You are listening to these words from somewhere solid, a floor that does not spin for artificial gravity, a sky that is not simulated, not filtered through glass and steel, not manufactured to feel like something it isn't. It is easy, from here, to imagine a generation ship as a machine, a set of numbers, a problem to be solved with better materials or cleverer engineering. It is not that. It was never only that. A generation ship is not a vehicle that happens to carry people. It is a civilization in miniature, sentenced to outlive its own founders, asked to remain whole across a length of time longer than most of what history has managed to hold together intact. The distance to the stars was never the real barrier. Voyager proved that decades ago, inching outward, watt by watt, toward a horizon it will never reach. The real barrier was always this: can a closed loop of air and water and soil hold its balance for centuries the way Biosphere 2s could not hold it for 2 years? Can a small founding population avoid the quiet arithmetic of inbreeding that even isolated islands have shown signs of within 200 years? Can a government outlast San Marino's 17 centuries without San Marino's mountain, its neighbors, its outside world to check its excesses? Can a language stay legible to its own descendants? Can a purpose, inherited rather than chosen, still feel worth the sacrifice, generation after generation, long after everyone who made the original choice is gone? This is why the idea changes everything once you actually sit with what it demands. It does not ask humanity to build a bigger rocket. It asks humanity to build something closer to a self-sustaining species, folded into a subtle vessel, carrying forward not just bodies but memory, language, purpose and trust. Across a span of time, no human institution has ever fully mastered without strain, interruption, or quiet erosion. And somewhere in that vessel, if it is ever built, there will be a person exactly like the one described a few minutes ago. Born in the middle, living in the middle, dying in the middle, most likely, having never seen either shore. Not a passenger, not quite a pioneer either. Something closer to a single lit window, drifting through centuries of dark, holding its small warm glow steady, not because the destination is visible, but because someone, long ago, decided the glow itself was worth carrying forward. The stars do not wait for us. But perhaps if we ever build a ship like this, we will not simply be crossing the distance between two worlds. We will be proving something quieter and far more difficult about what a human civilization can hold on to, together, in the dark, for as long as it takes.